Arriving home on a cold night, a millionaire found an 8-year-old girl sleeping, frightened and shivering, in the garden tool shed. Moved by compassion, he brought her inside the mansion, where his wife, confined to a wheelchair for 3 years after a devastating accident, curiously questioned the presence of the unknown child who had entered their lives. The next day, when he returned from work, he witnessed a scene that made him collapse completely in tears. The evening fog crept across the perfectly manicured lawn, swallowing the prize-winning rose bushes and clinging to the stained glass windows of the immense mansion like a weary ghost. For Arthur, the man watching the scene from inside his silent car, the fog was merely a reflection of the haze that had settled over his soul 3 long years ago. The master of an incalculable fortune, built with the sharp intelligence that made him a titan of Wall Street, he was a king in a castle from which joy had been exiled. Every night, as he passed through the wrought iron gates, the weight of his deals and the money he managed would dissolve, replaced by an anguish that no amount of capital in the world could alleviate. He could move markets with a single phone call, but he couldn't draw a genuine smile from his wife, Helena. He cut the engine, and the ensuing silence was profound, almost sacred. He was in no hurry to go inside. Within awaited the same routine of polished silences and meticulous care that had defined his days since the accident. One wrong step, one misplaced word, and the fragile structure of normalcy he fought to maintain could shatter. Before heading to the main door, he felt an inexplicable urge to walk through the side garden, a habit he'd developed to postpone the encounter with his home's quietude. The cold air bit at his face, but he barely felt it. His thoughts were on Helena, on her smile that once lit up every room and was now a painful memory, kept like a relic. It was then that a subtle movement near the old tool shed caught his attention. It was almost imperceptible, a shadow within the darkness. Frowning, Arthur moved closer, his heart beating a little faster with a contained irritation. Vandals. The estate was secure, but there were holes in the back fence that he, in his apathy, had never bothered to have fixed. He opened the creaking wooden door, and what he saw made him stop, his breath caught in his throat. Curled up on a pile of old burlap sacks was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8, a bundle of sharp bones and ragged clothes. Shivering uncontrollably, her dark hair was matted, and her face, smudged with soot, had the pallor of exhaustion. At the sound of the door, she startled awake, her enormous, frightened eyes locking onto him. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall like a cornered animal, bracing for a blow or a shout. Her reaction, so instinctive and full of terror, completely disarmed Arthur. The irritation gave way to a wave of compassion so overwhelming it left him dizzy. He saw in her not an intruder, but a fragility that mirrored that of his own home. He raised his hands slowly, a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer than he'd used it in years. "What's your name?" The girl just shook her head, tears streaming silently down her dirty cheeks. He tried again, asking where she came from, why she was there. Her silence was an impassable wall, but her eyes screamed a story of flight and terror. Arthur knew he couldn't leave her there. It would be a cruelty his conscience couldn't bear. "Come on," he said, extending a hand. "It's warm inside. You can have something to eat." She hesitated, fear warring with the cold and hunger visible in her trembling frame. Finally, with painful reluctance, she placed her tiny, ice-cold hand in his. Leading her toward the mansion, he felt the responsibility of that gesture. As they entered the marble foyer, under the light of a crystal chandelier worth a small fortune, the girl looked around, awestruck and terrified. In that instant, a soft, familiar sound broke the silence. The electric whir of Helena's wheelchair coming from the dark hallway. Arthur froze, the girl's hand still in his. He had just brought chaos into the sanctuary he'd built to protect his wife. The sound grew closer, and he had no idea how he would explain the small, frightened stranger he had brought into the heart of his fractured world. The electric whir was the soundtrack to his failure. Every time he heard the wheels of Helena's chair gliding across the polished marble floors, Arthur felt a pang of guilt in his chest, a constant reminder of his impotence. Helena emerged in the archway of the hall, her silhouette framed by the soft light from the library. Her eyes, a deep blue that once rivaled the ocean, landed first on his hand, intertwined with the small stranger's, then rose to meet his face. There was a silent question in her gaze, but also a barrier of ice he knew all too well. It was the wall she'd built to protect herself from the world, and especially from pity. "Arthur, what is this?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a sharp edge that cut the air. None of his vast assets or the roaring success of his investments had prepared him for this moment. He was a man who dealt with billionaires and traded in dollars and euros as easily as he breathed. But here, in his own home, he felt like a helpless boy. "I found her in the tool shed," he explained, his voice low. "She was sleeping in there. She was cold." He felt the girl's hand squeeze his tighter, a small gesture of panic. Helena's attention shifted entirely to the child. Her face, usually a mask of resignation, softened for an instant. She saw the trembling, the wide, fearful eyes, the grime staining the pale skin. For a moment, the woman Arthur loved, the compassionate Helena, emerged from beneath the cloak of sorrow. She maneuvered her wheelchair closer, and the girl took a step back, hiding behind Arthur's leg. "She's hungry," Helena stated, not as a question, but as a fact. The suspicion was still there, a wary glint in her eyes. But the hostility Arthur had feared didn't materialize. He let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Maria!" Helena called, her voice echoing through the silent hall. "I'd prepare a warm bath and something for our guests to eat." The housekeeper, Maria, a grey-haired woman with a kind smile, appeared almost instantly. Her eyes widened at the scene, but she asked no questions. With quiet efficiency, she approached and, in a gentle voice, invited the girl to follow her. The child looked up at Arthur, seeking permission. He nodded, letting go of her hand. Watching her leave with Maria toward the guest wing was like releasing a small, wild bird. When he turned, he found Helena's gaze fixed on him. "Just for tonight, Arthur," she said, the barrier back in place. "Tomorrow we'll sort this out." He just agreed, knowing it was useless to argue. The night passed in a veiled tension. Later, Maria reported that the girl, after a bath and devouring a bowl of soup and bread, had fallen asleep the instant her head hit the soft pillow of the guest bed. Arthur tried to work in his study, reviewing stock reports and the cash flow of his companies, but the images of the girl huddled in the shed wouldn't leave his mind. This kind of suffering couldn't be solved with money. For the first time in a long while, a problem had entered his life that had no financial solution. Exhausted, he finally went up to his room. Passing through the silent hallway, he felt a pressing need to check on the girl. It was a protective instinct that surprised him. He turned the brass knob of the guest room door with the utmost care, opening it just a crack. The hall light illuminated the lavish room, with its four-poster bed and oak furniture, but the vast silk comforter was smooth, the pillow untouched. The bed was empty. Arthur's heart plummeted, a cold panic seizing him. He threw the door wide, his eyes scanning the room, and then he saw them, the small, dirty, bare feet, just visible beneath the heavy velvet curtain that covered the floor-to-ceiling window. She hadn't run. She was hiding, watching the darkness outside. The sight of the small feet under the velvet curtain sent a chill down Arthur's spine. She didn't trust the luxury, didn't trust the safety. Her instinct was to hide, to remain invisible. He approached slowly, his steps muffled by the Persian rug. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice a thread in the vast silence of the room. "You're safe here." The curtain fabric trembled, but she didn't emerge. He could feel the intensity of the fear emanating from that small body. Who, or what, was she running from with such terror? The refusal to speak, the need to hide, it was more than the simple wariness of a street kid. There was trauma here, deep and recent. He knelt at a respectful distance. "I won't make you do anything. But the bed is much more comfortable than the floor." He waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft ticking of an antique clock in the hall. Finally, the curtain moved, and she peeked out, her eyes like those of a startled fawn in a hunter's sights. She studied him for a long moment, assessing his sincerity. Arthur held her gaze, trying to convey a calm he didn't feel himself. Slowly, as if each movement were a monumental decision, she stepped out from her hiding place. Instead of going to the bed, she walked to the velvet armchair in the corner, climbed onto it, and curled into a ball, hugging her knees. It was a compromise. She wouldn't go to the bed, the most vulnerable place in a room, but she also wouldn't return to the curtain. For Arthur, it was a small victory, a sliver of trust. He took a wool blanket from the foot of the bed and draped it gently over her. His fingers brushed her arm for an instant, and he felt how thin she was. That minimal contact seemed to break something inside him, a dam of emotions he'd kept tightly controlled. The wealth he had amassed, his vast net worth, seemed obscene in the face of such palpable misery. He left her there, closing the door with infinite care, and went to his own room. But sleep didn't come. Her image, curled up and vigilant, haunted him. The next morning, the atmosphere in the mansion was charged. Helena was in the conservatory, a glass-enclosed space Arthur had built for her after the accident, a place where she could be surrounded by nature without leaving her chair. He found her there, staring at the rare orchids he had imported from all over the world, another futile attempt to buy happiness. "Is she awake?" Helena asked, without turning. "Yes, Maria is with her in the kitchen," he replied. "She hasn't said a word yet." Helena finally wheeled her chair around to face him, her expression unreadable. "And what do you plan to do, Arthur? We can't just keep her. There's a system, social workers." He knew she was right. His life was governed by rules and structures, from managing his investment funds to the schedules of Helena's caregivers. A child with no name and no history didn't fit on any spreadsheet. "I know. I'll call the authorities today," he promised, though the idea caused him a deep unease. Later, as he was having coffee in the dining room, he saw her. The girl, now clean and dressed in clothes Maria had found, likely from a niece, stood in the doorway watching him. She no longer seemed so frightened, but rather curious. She approached the table and pointed to a small vase of flowers in the center. "Lilies," Arthur said. She shook her head and, in a voice low and hoarse from disuse, spoke her first word, "Ornithogalum." Arthur stared at her, stunned. "What?" She pointed again. "Star of Bethlehem. Ornithogalum. It helps with shock and trauma." He was speechless. How would a street kid know the botanical name of a flower, and more, its supposed therapeutic properties? Before he could ask, her eyes shifted past him, toward the conservatory. She saw Helena, alone, trying to reach a watering can on a slightly too high shelf, frustration marking her face. The girl watched for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she turned and walked decisively toward Helena, leaving a completely astonished Arthur behind. Arthur watched, paralyzed, as the small figure crossed the dining room and entered the conservatory. Each of her steps was deliberate, without the hesitation she had shown until now. He braced himself for a sharp reaction from Helena. His wife hated being seen in moments of weakness, and her frustration with her physical limitations was an open wound, always ready to bleed. The girl, however, didn't offer help directly. Instead, she stopped beside a plant with broad leaves and, with surprising agility, climbed onto the large ceramic planter. From there, with the balance of a gymnast, she reached the watering can on the shelf and held it out to Helena. It was all done in silence, with a naturalness that disarmed the situation. Helena took the object, astonishment overriding her initial irritation. She looked at the girl, who had already climbed down, and for the first time Arthur saw genuine curiosity in his wife's eyes. "Thank you," Helena said, her voice little more than a whisper. The girl just nodded, her large, serious eyes fixed on her. The little intruder, whom they began to call Leah, as it was the only sound she made when they tried to ask her name, started following Helena around the house like a silent shadow. She asked for nothing, spoke almost nothing, but observed everything, and in subtle ways she began to intervene. One day, Helena dropped her book. Before Arthur or the nurse could move, Leah was there, picking up the book and placing it back in her lap. On another occasion, while the physical therapist was doing the daily painful exercises with Helena, Leah watched from a corner, her brow furrowed in concentration. Arthur, who always made a point of being present for these sessions, noticed the girl's critical gaze. When the professional finished, Leah approached. She gently touched Helena's ankle, which was stiff and contracted, and began to make small circular motions, pressing specific points the therapist had ignored. What are you doing?" the therapist asked, her tone bordering on offense. Leah didn't answer with words. She looked at Helena, and Helena, to everyone's surprise, gestured for her to continue. Under Leah's delicate touch, something seemed to release. A sigh of relief escaped Helena's lips. It was a minuscule change, almost imperceptible, but to Arthur, who studied his wife's every micro-expression, it was like an earthquake. "Where did you learn that?" he asked the girl later, when they were alone. Leah looked down at her own hands, as if they held a secret. "Grandma," she murmured, and that was all she said. The mystery surrounding her only deepened. She was a child who knew botanical names and physical therapy techniques, yet she hid behind curtains and barely spoke. The days turned into a week. Arthur postponed the call to the authorities, making excuses to himself. Leah's presence, as strange as it was, had broken the oppressive monotony of the mansion. She was a living puzzle that distracted his mind from the constant pain. Helena, though still wary, seemed less closed off. The girl had become a focal point for her, something outside of her own condition. One afternoon, Arthur arrived home from the office early. The profit from one of his cryptocurrency holdings had surpassed all expectations, but the news barely registered. His thoughts were at home. The silence greeted him as always, but this time it was different. It wasn't an empty silence, but one of expectation. He walked toward the living room, from where a soft light emanated. The scene he found made him stop in the doorway, his heart pounding. Helena was not in her wheelchair. She was on the floor, on a soft rug, and Leah was beside her, guiding her legs through a series of slow, deliberate stretches. They were exercises he had never seen, movements that seemed both gentle and incredibly complex. Helena's breath was ragged with effort, but on her face was something Arthur hadn't seen in 3 years: determination. Arthur remained on the threshold, an invisible spectator to a sacred moment. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with a new energy, a mixture of concentrated effort and a fragile, almost terrifying hope. Leah guided Helena's movements with a silent authority that belied her age. Her small hands pressed and stretched the muscles in Helena's legs with a precision that seemed to come from years of practice. She said nothing, only demonstrated, and Helena, with sweat glistening on her forehead, mimicked her face contorted in a mask of pain and fierce determination. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He, who had hired the world's best specialists, who had spent a considerable part of his estate on cutting-edge treatments, was witnessing more significant progress at the hands of a mysterious child than in 3 years of conventional medicine. The scene was both wonderful and deeply unsettling. Who was this girl? He backed away without a sound, deciding not to interrupt. The moment belonged to them. In his office, surrounded by stock market charts and dividend reports that now seemed meaningless, he felt more lost than ever. Leah's presence in his home was a deviation from all his plans, an uncontrollable variable in his meticulously organized life. Postponing the call to social services was no longer an option. It was a conscious decision. He needed to understand what was happening. He needed time. The girl was the first spark of light in Helena's darkness, and he clung to it with the strength of a drowning man. The thought of turning her over to a bureaucratic, impersonal system felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of the new, tenuous hope she had ignited. In the days that followed, a routine was established. Every afternoon, Leah and Helena had their sessions on the living room rug. Arthur watched them from a distance, amazed and apprehensive. The strength in Helena's legs seemed to gradually increase. She could hold them straight for longer, flex her ankles with a little more control. They were minuscule victories, but to them, they were miracles. The change in Helena wasn't just physical. A new color seemed to have returned to her face. She began to talk more, to ask about Arthur's day, to take an interest in the news. The wall of ice around her was beginning to thaw, revealing glimpses of the vibrant woman he had feared he'd lost forever. And it was all because of Leah. The girl, for her part, remained an enigma. She spoke only when necessary, but her eyes absorbed everything. She seemed to understand the dynamics of the house, the unspoken pain between Arthur and Helena, with a wisdom that didn't belong to an 8-year-old. One night, as he was reading to Helena in bed, a habit they had long abandoned but recently resumed, the bedroom door creaked open. Leah stood there, holding a glass of water. "For you," she whispered, offering it to Helena. "It helps the muscles relax." Helena smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made Arthur's heart ache with happiness. "Thank you, sweetie." Leah placed the glass on the nightstand and, instead of leaving, stood by the bed. She reached out and touched Helena's arm. "Grandma said the body remembers how to move," she said, her voice clear and firm. "You just have to wake up its memory." Arthur felt a shiver. The sentence was so simple, yet charged with a profound conviction. "Your grandmother, was she a doctor?" he asked, trying not to sound intrusive. Leah shook her head. "She healed people, the ones the doctors said had no hope left." The statement hung in the air, full of implications. A healer, a physical therapist with her own methods. The mystery deepened with every fragment of information she revealed. Before Arthur could ask another question, a sound cut through the night. The front doorbell rang, loud and insistent, shattering the peace of the moment. It was late. Almost 10 o'clock. No one visited them at this hour. The sound echoed through the house with a tone of foreboding. Leah flinched instantly, the little color she had draining from her face. Her eyes widened in pure panic, the same panic Arthur had seen on the first night in the tool shed. She ran to the window, peering through a crack in the curtain. "It's them," she whispered, her voice trembling with terror. "They found me." Leah's words, whispered with absolute terror, froze the blood in Arthur's veins. "Who, Leah? Who found you?" he asked, getting up from the bed quickly. But the girl was no longer listening. She was in her own world of panic, her eyes fixed on the headlights sweeping across the mansion's driveway below. Helena pushed herself up on her elbows, her face pale with concern. "Arthur, what's happening?" The doorbell rang again, this time more urgently, the sound a judgment. Arthur rushed to the window, looking over Leah's shoulder. An official-looking sedan, unmarked, was parked on the gravel drive. Two figures, a man and a woman, were getting out. Their formal clothes and stiff postures screamed authority, social services. Somehow they had tracked her down. Guilt hit him like a punch to the gut. He had postponed the inevitable, hoping the problem would just go away, but the real world had come knocking. "Stay here with Helena." "Don't open the door for anyone," he told Leah, his voice firm, trying to project a calm he was far from feeling. He took the stairs in seconds, his heart hammering against his ribs. He, a man whose net worth gave him access to the highest echelons of society, felt cornered in his own home. He opened the door to find the pair, who introduced themselves as Miss Davis and Mr. Peterson, from the Department of Child and Family Services. "Good evening, Mr. Montero," said Miss Davis, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense gaze. "We received an anonymous tip about an unaccompanied minor residing at this address. We're here to verify the situation." An anonymous tip. Someone had been watching them. The disgruntled physical therapist, one of the staff. It didn't matter, they were here. "There's been a misunderstanding," Arthur began, trying to buy time. "She's a distant relative, here for a visit." The lie sounded weak even to his own ears. Mr. Peterson, a younger man with a stern expression, consulted a clipboard. "A girl named Leah, a runaway from the Northwood State Children's Home. The description fits, sir. We need to see her." The name of the home hit him. It was an institution with a bad reputation, known for being underfunded and overcrowded. Now her flight made more sense. "She's asleep," Arthur insisted. "You can't just take her in the middle of the night. It would terrify her." Miss Davis sighed, a sound of professional impatience. "Mr. Montero, we understand your concern, but the law is clear. She is a ward of the state. Unless you have custody papers, which I know you don't, we are required to take her back." The word custody sparked an idea in his mind. It was a bureaucratic maze, but it wasn't impossible. He was Arthur Montero. Systems and red tape were obstacles he knew how to navigate, usually with a large sum of money or the best lawyers. "I want to start the process of becoming her legal guardian," he declared, the decision solidifying the moment the words left his mouth. The surprise on the social workers' faces was evident. They had likely expected resistance, not such a drastic declaration of intent. "That's a long and complicated process, sir," Ms. Davis said, recovering her composure. "It requires evaluations, hearings. I have the best lawyers my money can buy. We'll start tomorrow morning," he cut her off. "Until then, she stays here, as my guest." There was a tense standoff. Arthur knew he was on shaky legal ground, but he was betting on his reputation and his obvious ability to provide a safe environment for the child. Finally, Ms. Davis relented, but only partially. "Very well, Mr. Montero. She can stay the night, but we will be back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp, and this time we'll have a court order. I'd advise you to have your lawyer present." They turned and left, leaving Arthur alone in the doorway, the cold night air enveloping him. He had bought a few hours, but the battle was just beginning. He walked back up the stairs slowly, the weight of his decision on his shoulders. When he reached the bedroom, he found Helena sitting in her wheelchair, which she had managed to get into herself, with Leah curled in her lap, sobbing quietly. Helena was stroking the girl's hair, rocking her with a tenderness Arthur hadn't seen in years. As she looked up, Helena's eyes met his, and in them was a desperate plea. "Don't let them take her, Arthur. Please." In that moment, he knew he was no longer fighting for just a strange child. He was fighting for the soul of his family. The next morning dawned grey and heavy, the sky the color of molten lead, perfectly mirroring the mood in the mansion. 9 o'clock approached like a runaway train. Arthur had barely slept. He had spent most of the night in his office on the phone with Julian Vance, the most voracious and competent lawyer his fortune could buy. "They have the law on their side, Arthur." Julian's voice was pragmatic over the line. "Runaway from a state institution. It's an open and shut case for them. Our best strategy is to delay, show we're cooperating with the guardianship process, and argue that removing her abruptly would be detrimental to the child's emotional well-being." Arthur hated the cold, calculated language of the law. This wasn't a case to him. It was a frightened little girl and a glimmer of hope for his wife. "Do whatever it takes, Julian. Use every resource. If you need more capital, let me know. I'm not losing her." He hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of fury and helplessness, a dangerous combination for a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his business. While Arthur fought his bureaucratic battle, a different, quieter, and more profound battle was being waged in the living room. The threat of imminent separation had forged an unbreakable bond between Helena and Leah. Helena, who had spent 3 years wrapped in a fog of apathy, now had a fire in her eyes. The idea that the authorities could tear Leah from her life was more terrifying than the accident itself. It was as if the possibility of losing hope was worse than never having had it. She was on the rug, ready for her exercise session, with a determination Arthur had never seen. Leah, in turn, seemed to draw strength from Helena's resolve. The fear was still in her eyes, but she channeled it into the task before her. Today wasn't just another day of exercise, it was an act of defiance. Arthur entered the room just as they were beginning. He had only meant to watch them for a moment before preparing for the social worker's arrival, but something in the intensity of the scene held him captive. Helena was groaning with effort, sweat trickling down her temples as she tried to contract her thigh muscles, following the silent guidance of Leah's hands. "Again," Leah whispered. The first time he'd heard her give a command, "You can do it. The body remembers." And Helena tried, her whole body trembling with the strain. Arthur felt like an intruder. He decided to go back to his office, to give them privacy. He turned, but stopped when he heard a different sound. It wasn't a groan of effort, but a sharp gasp, a mixture of shock and triumph. He spun back around, his heart in his throat, expecting to see Helena collapsed or hurt. But what he saw made the world stop spinning. Helena wasn't on the floor. She was on her feet, trembling violently from head to toe, one hand gripping the back of a heavy leather armchair with such force her knuckles were white. The other hand rested on Leah's small shoulder, who stood beside her, steady as a rock, her face lifted toward Helena with an expression of pure concentration. And then it happened. Before Arthur's disbelieving eyes, Helena moved her right foot. A shuffle, a drag, an inch, maybe 2. It was the most awkward, wavering movement he had ever seen, but it was a step, and then another, with her left foot. Tears welled in Arthur's eyes, hot and uncontrollable. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a hope so pure and overwhelming it hurt, mixed with the terror that this was just a dream, a hallucination born of desperation. Helena lifted her face, her tear-filled eyes meeting his from across the room. A trembling, exultant smile spread across her lips. In that instant of pure miracle, of sacred silence, the sharp, shrill ring of the front doorbell tore through the air. Cruel and merciless, they had arrived. The sound of the doorbell was a nail driven into the heart of that perfect moment. For a second, the universe split into 2 realities for Arthur: the miraculous image of his wife standing, supported by a child, and the brutal, insistent call of the world outside, coming to destroy it all. Helena faltered, the exhaustion and shock of the situation hitting her at once. She sank back into the armchair, not with the weakness of before, but with the slowness of one conserving energy for a fight. Her eyes, still shining with tears of triumph, now burned with a protective fury. "No, Arthur," she said, her voice trembling but laced with steel. "They're not taking her." Leah shrank behind the armchair, and terror once again dominating her features. The progress, the confidence, all seemed to evaporate in the face of the familiar threat. Arthur felt a wave of anger so intense it left him dizzy. He, a multi-millionaire who commanded empires and whose word altered the cash flow of corporations, was being besieged in his own home. He took a deep breath, forcing the calm Julian had advised. He opened the door to Miss Davis and Mr. Peterson. this time flanked by two uniformed police officers, their presence a clear show of force. "Mr. Montero," Miss Davis said, getting straight to the point and holding out a document. "Court order. I'm sorry, but the discussion is over." Arthur stared at the paper in his hands. None of his assets or holdings could nullify that piece of paper. The law, cold and impersonal, was on their side. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and tense. "Something's happened. You need to see this." He stepped back from the door, a silent invitation. Cautiously, the social workers entered, the officers remaining in the foyer. As they stepped into the living room, they stopped short. The scene was not what they expected, not a frightened child being held hostage in a gilded cage, but a woman in an armchair with a defiant expression, and a girl hiding behind her, peeking out with terrified eyes. "As you can see, she's safe and well cared for," Arthur said, his voice gaining strength. "In fact, she's been instrumental in my wife's recovery." Ms. Davis cast a skeptical glance at Helena. "Recovery? Mr. Montero, your wife's medical records are a matter of public record. Paraplegia resulting from a spinal cord injury. There is no recovery from that." It was Helena who answered, her voice clear and resonant in the quiet room. "Until today, I believed that too." With a monumental effort that made everyone hold their breath, she gripped the arms of the chair and, using the strength she had just discovered, pushed herself up, standing for a few unsteady seconds before sitting back down. A stunned silence filled the room. Mr. Peterson dropped his clipboard. "That's impossible," he stammered. Arthur felt a surge of hope. "You see, this girl, Leah, she has a gift. Taking her from here would not only be cruel to her, but it would interrupt a medical process your own experts call impossible." Ms. Davis, though visibly shaken, regained her professional posture. "That is extraordinary, Mrs. Montero. Truly. But how? What kind of treatment was used?" All eyes turned to Leah, who shrank even further. The pressure was too much. Arthur knelt beside her. "Leah, it's okay, just tell them." "What did your grandmother do?" The girl's eyes filled with tears. She looked to Helena, seeking courage. "Grandma, she wasn't a doctor," Leah whispered, her voice choked. "She was a researcher, a physical therapist, the best. She developed experimental techniques for the spine. She said traditional medicine was too slow, that it didn't understand how the body wanted to heal itself." The revelation hung in the air. Stunning. A renowned physical therapist with experimental techniques. Mrs. Davis frowned, suspicion warring with amazement. "Your grandmother's name, child. What was her name?" Leah swallowed hard, fear etched on her face. "Dr. Anneliese Schmidt." The name hit Ms. Davis like a lightning bolt. Her eyes widened in recognition. Anneliese Schmidt, the researcher who disappeared a few years ago after losing her funding over her radical theories. They thought she'd left the country. The mention of Anneliese Schmidt changed the entire dynamic in the room. The skepticism on the social workers' faces was replaced by a dazed confusion. Anneliese Schmidt wasn't some village healer. She was a legendary, if controversial, figure in neurological rehabilitation circles. A visionary whose theories on spinal cord neuroplasticity were deemed too radical by the orthodox medical community, leading to her funding being cut and her eventual disappearance from public life. The idea that her 8-year-old granddaughter was the vessel of her revolutionary knowledge was almost unbelievable. But the evidence was right there, in the woman who had just stood up for the first time in 3 years. "Anneliese Schmidt was your grandmother," Miss Davis repeated, her voice full of awe. Leah nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "She took care of me since I was born. She taught me everything. I would watch her, helping people. I just did what I saw." Arthur felt the ground solidify beneath his feet. This wasn't some mystical gift. It was science, however unconventional. It was something that could be explained documented. It was the ammunition his lawyer needed. "You see," Arthur said, his voice calm but with an unshakable authority, "this is no ordinary situation. We have a child here with extraordinary knowledge who is, in fact, producing a medical miracle. To take her back to an institution would be like burning a miniature library of Alexandria. For my wife's sake, and for the potential this girl represents, I implore you to reconsider." Miss Davis exchanged a long, meaningful look with Mr. Peterson. The court order was still in her hand, a symbol of her duty, but the situation had become infinitely more complex. To remove Anneliese Schmidt's granddaughter from an environment where she was visibly achieving the impossible would be, at the very least, a moral, if not legal, negligence. "We need to make some calls," she said finally, her professional demeanor now tinged with uncertainty. As the social workers retreated to the hall to discuss the situation privately, a new kind of tension settled in. The immediate threat had been postponed, but the war was far from over. Helena, exhausted but radiant, took Leah's hand. "You were so brave," she whispered. "Your grandmother would be so proud of you." For the first time, a small smile touched Leah's lips. She was no longer just a scared runaway. She was the keeper of a legacy, and that realization seemed to give her a new strength. However, the revelation about her grandmother opened a Pandora's box of new questions. Why was Anneliese Schmidt living in obscurity? What had happened to her? And why did Leah end up alone and on the run? Arthur knew he would need these answers to strengthen his case for custody. The authorities wouldn't grant guardianship of such a valuable child without a full investigation. His investments and inheritance could buy the best lawyers, but they couldn't buy the truth. The subplot of Helena's fear began to deepen. Now that she had proven to herself that she could stand, that hope was not an illusion. A new terror took hold of her. The fear of losing it all, the fear of a relapse, that the progress would stop, that Leah would be taken away and she would return to the prison of her chair. This new vulnerability made her emotionally unstable. One moment, she was euphoric, planning the day she would walk through the garden again. The next, she was gripped by a silent panic, watching Leah with a desperate possessiveness. What if they take her? "Arthur," she asked him that night, her voice fragile, "what if this is all taken from us? I don't think I could bear it." Arthur held her, feeling the tremor in her body. He had spent 3 years trying to protect her from hopelessness. Now he had to protect her from the fragility of a newborn hope, which was in many ways an even heavier burden. The battle was no longer just against the system. It was also against the specter of their own failure, which now had a much crueler face. The social workers' decision was a postponement, not a victory. They agreed to leave Leah in Arthur and Helena's temporary care on the condition of weekly supervision and the immediate start of formal custody proceedings. The mansion, once a silent sanctuary, became an operations center. Lawyers came and went, their leather briefcases full of legal strategies, doctors and specialists, drawn by the whispered news of the Montero miracle, came to observe Leah's sessions with Helena, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and fascination. Leah's story and her grandmother's legacy was a puzzle that Julian, the lawyer, tried to piece together. He discovered that after losing her funding, Anneliese Schmidt had retreated to a small house in the countryside, where she continued her research independently, using her savings and treating a few select patients who had lost faith in traditional medicine. She had died suddenly of a heart attack a few months prior, leaving Leah in the care of a neighbor who, overwhelmed, turned her over to the system. Leah, now the center of a whirlwind of attention, withdrew. The clinical curiosity of the doctors and the pointed questions from the lawyers intimidated her. Her sessions with Helena became her only refuge, the one place she wasn't a phenomenon to be studied, but simply Leah. Helena, meanwhile, was battling her own demons. The emotional instability Arthur had feared began to manifest. Some days, she woke up full of energy, eager for her exercises. On others, the slightest difficulty, a muscle that didn't respond as it had the day before, plunged her into deep despair. "It's not working," she cried one day, after failing to repeat a movement she had mastered. "I'm going backward. I knew it was too good to be true." Leah, with a maturity far beyond her years, simply held her hand. "Grandma said healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes you have to take one step back to get the momentum for 2 steps forward." The constant presence of strangers and the pressure to perform began to weigh on the girl. The final straw came in the form of a particularly arrogant doctor, a Dr. Wallace, who openly questioned her methods. "Well, this isn't science. It's lucky charlatanism," he declared during one observation, treating Leah as if she weren't in the room. "Likely a case of spontaneous remission. The child has nothing to do with it." The cruelty of his words hit Leah like a physical blow. That afternoon, for the first time, she refused to go to her session with Helena. She locked herself in the guest room and wouldn't answer the door. Helena's panic was immediate and overwhelming. She's abandoned me," she whispered, her voice broken. "She thinks I'm a lost cause too." Arthur tried to reason with her, to explain, but the seed of doubt, planted by Dr. Wallace and watered by Helena's own insecurity, had taken root. That same day, a new complication arose, a threat far more tangible than state bureaucracy. Julian called Arthur with alarming news. "We have a problem, Arthur. A big one. A relative of Leah's has surfaced. A great uncle. Annalise's brother, named Silas Schmidt. He's petitioning for custody." Arthur's heart went cold. He was never in her life. Where was he when his sister died and the girl was left alone? "Exactly," Julian said. "He's come out of the woodwork. And my gut tells me he's not interested in his niece's well-being. He's interested in the profit potential of her gift. I found out he has massive gambling debts. He saw a chance to exploit the girl's abilities. The image of a greedy man wanting to turn Leah's knowledge into a lucrative sideshow disgusted Arthur. He would not let them turn this child into a circus act. The news of the uncle shook the fragile stability of the house even more. Helena saw him as the personification of her greatest fear, the person who would succeed in taking Leah away forever. The pressure on the girl, already immense, became unbearable. That night, Arthur went to her room. The door was ajar. Leah was sitting at the window, staring into the darkness, just as she had on the first night. He sat in the nearby armchair. "I know this is all scary," he said softly, "but we're going to protect you. Helena and I, your family now." Leah turned to him, her eyes filled with a sadness no child should ever know. "People always want something," she said, her voice low. "First the doctors, wanting my secret. Now this man I don't even know, wanting... I don't know what. Maybe I should have stayed on the street. At least nobody wanted anything from me." Her words, so full of weary resignation, broke Arthur's heart. He was trying to save her, but the world he represented, with its money, power, and complications, seemed only to be suffocating her. The impending arrival of Silas Schmidt hung over the mansion like a storm cloud. Julian Vance used every legal maneuver to delay the meeting, buying precious time that Arthur used to try and restore the fragile peace in his home. Leah's refusal to continue the exercises had plunged Helena into a devastating emotional relapse. She barely left her room, refusing to get into her wheelchair, as if the immobility itself were a form of punishment. The physical progress they had made seemed to evaporate in the face of the paralysis of hope. "It's useless." "Arthur," she would say, her empty gaze fixed on the window. It all depended on her. And now, she's given up on me. It was a self-feeding spiral of despair. The pressure on Leah caused her to withdraw, which deepened Helena's hopelessness, which in turn increased the guilt and pressure on the girl. Arthur felt trapped in the middle, desperately trying to hold both ends of a fraying rope. He knew he had to break the vicious cycle before Silas Schmidt arrived to sever the rope for good. He focused his efforts on Leah. He stopped talking about the exercises or about Helena. Instead, he tried to connect with the child behind the gift. He took her for walks through the vast gardens, showed her his butterfly collection, told her stories of his travels. Slowly, very slowly, he saw the girl begin to lower her guard. One afternoon, as they sat by the lake, she finally spoke about what frightened her. Grandma Annalise, she hid from people like Dr. Wallace and this uncle, Leah said, plucking at a blade of grass. They wanted to take her work, to turn it into something ugly, into money. She said healing is sacred, not a business. She made me promise I would protect her legacy. Arthur finally understood. Leah's refusal wasn't abandonment. It was an act of protection. She was honoring the promise she had made to her grandmother. Leah, what you are doing with Helena isn't a business, he said, his voice full of conviction. It's an act of love, and that's the most sacred thing of all. Protecting your grandmother's legacy doesn't mean hiding it, but using it in the right way. And you are doing that. The words seemed to strike a chord. Leah didn't answer, but Arthur saw a shift in her eyes, a flicker of understanding. That evening, she knocked softly on Helena's bedroom door. Arthur, who was sitting by the bed, felt a wave of relief. Leah entered and went to Helena. I'm sorry, she whispered. I haven't given up on you. I was just scared. Helena, whose eyes were red from crying, reached out and pulled the girl into a tight hug. I was scared too, Helena sobbed. I thought I'd lost you. The reconciliation was a balm on the wounded soul of the house. The next day, the sessions resumed. Not with the pressure of before Qing, but with a new partnership forged in shared vulnerability. Meanwhile, Julian was making disturbing discoveries. Arthur, this is bigger than we thought, he said over the phone, his voice grave. Silas Schmidt isn't acting alone. He's being bankrolled, and guess by whom? Apex Construction. The name hit him like a physical blow. Apex, the construction firm responsible for the site of Helena's accident. Their negligence, a poorly secured steel beam that had fallen onto the highway, caused the pile-up that changed their lives forever. They had settled out of court, paying a substantial sum, but an admission of guilt was never formalized. The connection was too sinister to be a coincidence. Why would Apex be interested in Leah? Arthur asked, his mind racing. It's diabolical, Arthur, Julian explained. They know that if Helena walks again, and if it's proven to be thanks to Annalise Schmidt's techniques, it sets a terrible precedent for them. It would mean her condition wasn't permanent, as their doctors testified. It could reopen the case, expose them to $1 billion lawsuit, not just from you, but from other victims of similar accidents. They found out about Leah, probably through a hospital or therapy staff leak, and they realized the threat. They're using Silas to get Leah out of your house before she can prove that Helena's paralysis was, in fact, reversible. The revelation was devastating. They weren't just fighting the greed of a distant relative. They were fighting a powerful, ruthless corporation that saw Helena's healing and Leah's freedom as a risk to its bottom line. The custody hearing, set for the following week, was no longer about a child's welfare. It was a battlefield where all their futures would be decided. The week leading up to the hearing was the longest of Arthur's life. The revelation of Apex Construction's involvement turned the custody battle into a David and Goliath confrontation. Though Arthur was far from a helpless David, he mobilized his vast resources, turning his study into a war room. Julian Vance and a team of lawyers worked around the clock, digging into Apex's records, looking for any weakness, any connection they could prove in court. While the legal war escalated, the emotional preparation inside the mansion was just as intense. The hearing represented the climax of all their struggles, the convergence of all their hopes and fears. Helena's health, Leah's future, and the very soul of their family were on the line. Helena, now aware of Apex's nefarious scheme, channeled her fear and anger into an iron resolve. Each session with Leah was performed with a precision and focus that bordered on fanatical. She was no longer just relearning to walk. She was training for the fight of her life. Every shaky step she took, holding onto furniture, was an act of defiance against the corporation that had tried to sentence her to a life of immobility. "They are not going to win, Leah," she would say, her breath ragged with effort. "We won't let them." Leah, in turn, found a new purpose. The external threat solidified her loyalty to Arthur and Helena. She was no longer a passive victim, she was a key player in the battle. She studied her grandmother's old notes, which had been recovered from her belongings, searching for exercises and techniques that could accelerate Helena's progress, preparing her for the big day. The house, once a place of silence and sorrow, now buzzed with a feverish energy, a mix of anxiety and purpose. Arthur watched it all with a mixture of pride and a deep fear that gnawed at his gut. He was betting everything, his fortune, his reputation, his family. Apex was a giant with tentacles all over the city, and he knew they wouldn't play fair. There were subtle attempts at intimidation, unfamiliar cars parked outside his gates, silent phone calls in the middle of the night. They were warnings, reminders of the power he was challenging. The day of the hearing arrived. A bright, sunny day that seemed to mock the darkness they felt inside. The courthouse was an imposing building of marble and dark wood, designed to intimidate. Silas Schmidt was there, a frail-looking man with shifty eyes, flanked by a team of expensive Apex lawyers whose smiles were as sharp as their suits. The hearing began, and Apex's strategy became clear. Their lawyers painted a picture of Arthur as an eccentric billionaire who had kidnapped a vulnerable child to use as a guinea pig in unorthodox experiments on his wife. They presented the testimony of Dr. Wallace, who described Leah's methods as dangerous and unscientific. Silas Schmidt took the stand, weeping crocodile tears, speaking of his familial duty and his concern for his great niece, who was being exploited. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Margaret Quinn, listened to it all with a stony impartiality, her face unreadable. Julian's case, while well argued, seemed technical and cold compared to the emotional drama manufactured by the opposition. Arthur felt despair begin to creep in. They were losing. The law, in its rigidity, couldn't see the miracle. Then it was Julian's turn to call his final witness. "I call to the stand, Your Honor, Mrs. Helena Montero." A murmur went through the courtroom. The Apex team exchanged smug smiles, expecting the sight of Helena in her wheelchair to bolster their argument that the treatment was ineffective. Arthur wheeled Helena to the front of the courtroom. She was pale, but her eyes shone with an intense light. She took her oath, her voice clear and firm. The Apex lawyer began his cross-examination, his tone condescending. "Mrs. Montero, is it true that despite this child's treatments, you are still confined to this wheelchair?" Helena looked at him, then at the judge, and then at Leah, who sat in the front row, her face pale with anxiety. She took a deep breath. A breath that seemed to carry the weight of the past 3 years. "Not anymore," she said. And then, gathering every ounce of strength, every drop of hope, every moment of pain and perseverance, she gripped the sides of her chair, planted her feet on the floor, and to the absolute shock of everyone in the courtroom, she stood up. The silence that fell over the courtroom was absolute, so profound you could hear dust settle. Lawyers, clerks, Judge Quinn herself, all stared, mouths agape in disbelief. Helena stood, trembling visibly from the Herculean effort, one hand resting on the witness box for support. But she was standing. The sound of a briefcase thudding to the floor, dropped by Apex's lead attorney, was the only noise to break the spell. The smug smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of pure panic. He saw his case, his fees, his carefully constructed strategy, all disintegrating before his eyes. Helena didn't stop there. With excruciating slowness, she took a step, then another, moving away from the wheelchair, her safety anchor, and toward the judge's bench. Each step was a victory, a living refutation of all the lies and manipulations. "Your Honor," Helena said, her voice breathless but resonating with an unshakable strength, "this girl, Leah, is not a guinea pig. She is not an experiment. She is the reason I am standing here today. She gave me back my hope when your experts and their doctors told me I would never walk again. Apex Construction doesn't want to protect my niece." She looked directly at Silas, who shrank in his chair. "They want to silence her, because the healing she has given me is living proof of their negligence. Proof that my condition didn't have to be a life sentence. They aren't trying to protect a child, Your Honor. They're trying to bury the truth." The passion and sincerity in her voice were undeniable. The physical demonstration of her recovery was more powerful evidence than any document or expert testimony. Judge Quinn looked at Helena, and for the first time, her stone-faced expression softened, revealing a profound respect. From that moment, the tide turned decisively. The judge ordered a full investigation into the allegations against Apex and Silas Schmidt's sudden custody claim. Faced with the threat of perjury and obstruction of justice charges, Silas crumbled. Confessing to the scheme and admitting that Apex had paid off all his debts and promised him a substantial sum in exchange for his cooperation in gaining custody of Leah. The Apex case imploded spectacularly. The decision on Leah's custody was almost a formality. Judge Quinn granted Arthur and Helena permanent guardianship, praising their dedication and the clearly positive environment they had provided for the girl. As she brought down the gavel, a sound of finality and justice echoed through the courtroom. In the front row, Arthur pulled Leah and Helena into a tight hug, and for the first time in a very long time, his tears were of pure, unadulterated joy. The victory in court was only the beginning. The exposure of the Apex scheme triggered a public scandal. Lawsuits from other victims of the company's accidents began to pile up. The corporation's net worth plummeted on the stock market as the news spread. Arthur, using his influence and capital, helped finance a fund to support the other victims, ensuring they had the legal resources to fight the corporate giant. Their first great victory was keeping Leah in their family, but it came with the weight of becoming the center of a media and legal firestorm. They faced threats and intimidation attempts from Apex, but they stood firm, united by their common purpose. The second victory, and perhaps the sweetest, was Helena's continued recovery. With the threat of separation removed, she flourished. The small steps in the courtroom became confident walks through the garden. Leah's techniques, once viewed with skepticism, were now being studied by open-minded doctors and researchers from around the world. Renowned specialists came to the mansion, not to judge, but to learn. They documented the methods, validated the results, and began to understand the science behind Anneliese Schmidt's legacy. The girl who had been called a charlatan was quietly starting a revolution in the treatment of spinal cord injuries. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the trial, Helena walked into Arthur's study, unaided, and hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for never giving up on me." Arthur held her tight. "I never gave up," he replied, "but it was Leah who showed us the way." They had won the legal and physical battles, but the journey to becoming a true family was just beginning. 5 weeks. It felt like a lifetime and a blink of an eye. Arthur stood in the garden, the same spot where he'd felt the urge to walk on that foggy night that changed everything. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and blooming roses. He watched the scene before him, a genuine, peaceful smile on his face, something he thought he would never feel again. Near the old tool shed, now converted into a charming little playhouse, Helena and Leah were planting a new flower bed. Helena was kneeling on the grass, digging in the soil with a small trowel, her laughter echoing through the garden as Leah, beside her, handed her the seedlings. There was no wheelchair in sight. It was propped against the mansion wall, forgotten, an artifact from a past life. Their final victory wasn't the collapse of Apex or the fortune they won in the subsequent civil suit. It wasn't the fame that came with establishing the Anneliese Schmidt Foundation for Neurological Recovery, which now offered free treatment to patients without resources using her grandmother's revolutionary techniques, documented and refined. The final victory was right here, in this simple, perfect moment. It was the sound of his wife's laughter, the sight of his daughter, for that is what Leah had become, in every way that mattered, her hands dirty with soil, and the profound peace that had settled in his own heart. The guilt that had haunted him for 3 years had dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming gratitude. He'd discovered that the real paralysis hadn't been in Helena's spinal cord, but in the hopelessness that had infected their souls. Leah, the child who had arrived a frightened intruder, was now the beating heart of their home. She had found a home, a family, and the safety to finally just be a child. But she was also the guardian of a powerful legacy, under the mentorship of doctors, who now treated her with the respect due a colleague. She began to understand the science behind the instincts she'd inherited, blending her grandmother's wisdom with modern knowledge. She was the bridge between the past and the future of medicine. The man who felt guilty for being unable to protect his wife had learned the hardest lesson of all, that you cannot control everything, and that sometimes surrendering to the unexpected is the only path to salvation. The greatest investments of his life weren't in stocks or cryptocurrency, but in the compassion he'd shown that night, an act that had paid him dividends of love and happiness that no amount of money could ever buy. Helena, who had believed she was doomed to see the world through a window, discovered that the limits of her body were far less restrictive than the limits she had placed on her own hope. She didn't just walk, she lived. She became the president of the foundation, the voice and face of hope for thousands. Her own story, the most powerful testament to what was possible. The family that had been shattered by trauma was rebuilt, not on the foundations of vast wealth, but on the pillars of resilience, selflessness, and the unconditional love a small orphan had taught them. Their net worth was no longer measured in dollars or gold, but in the everyday miracles they witnessed and made possible. Arthur walked over to them. Leah looked up, a bright, dirt-smudged grin on her face. "Dad, come help us," she called out. The word "dad" sounding natural and right. He knelt between the two women in his life, feeling the soft earth beneath his knees. Helena took his hand, her fingers lacing through his with a comforting familiarity. Together, the three of them planted the last seedling, a small star of Bethlehem, the same flower Leah had named on her first day. As they covered its roots with soil, Arthur looked up at the blazing sky. He realized the fog had finally lifted, not just from the garden, but from his life. And in its place, everything was clear, bright, and filled with the infinite promise of new beginnings.